Tradition is easily one of the most misunderstood words in the vernacular of modern life. We tend to think of it as something like arbitrary freedom restricting customs imposed by the rich and the powerful on the poor and the weak as a measure of control and dominance. I've often heard people say this about the Catholic Church or just religion in general. When I was a student-aged person, I would have completely agreed with that definition. But in actuality, all tradition is the transmission of a way of life from one generation to the next, which is exactly why we have something like education. Education at its best is a mechanism of tradition. It takes the knowledge, the wisdom, and the customs of a people and ensures that successive generations don't have to rediscover or reinvent all of that knowledge from scratch, that they can be given a head start and can build upon what it is that they inherit. Which is how tradition is actually progressive in the truest sense of that word. Progress can only happen by moving forward or building further, but modern progress is about rejecting what came before in preference for novelty and change for their own sake. But that's actually completely counter-progressive. Like, imagine building something like a railway, like a system that would cover an entire continent, something that would be a multi-generational project. So you get the land surveys, the routes, and the resources to begin work, and in a generation or like 20 years or so, you make a lot of progress and you learn a lot about how to do what you're trying to do along the way. Then, as the next generation is poised to get involved and eventually take over, you share with them everything that you've learned, like the best ways to break through certain kinds of rocks and mountains, the best ways to set up work camps as you go, the best way to lay track in an efficient manner. But the new generation, they're too progressive to accept any of that advice. In fact, they think everything you've built so far should just be scrapped and started over. If every generation treated the inheritance passed down by a previous generation like that, they'd never get the railroad built. No progress would be made. And this is exactly how modern man thinks about progress. He holds his ancestors' methods and wisdom in contempt out of the naked assumption that he can do it better because he's progressive. C.S. Lewis uses the analogy of travel. He says that in order to get where you're going, you have to continue to move forward in the direction you had done so previously. Every successive effort must be in harmony with the previous one. But if you were constantly second-guessing your past choices and arbitrarily changing directions out of the mistaken notion that change and progress are synonymous, then you'd never get to your destination. In other words, you'd never progress. He also makes the point that if you are going the wrong way, sometimes going backwards is the most progressive thing to do, which is something that progressives of today always use as a scare tactic against stopping whatever agenda that they're pursuing in favor of going back to what we had before. So again, tradition is nothing more than passing on the wealth of a culture from one generation to the next. It's how we have the technology and the science, for example, that we do. It depends on one generation looking at those objects of value and then their willingness to dedicate the time to teaching the next generation about it so that they don't have to reinvent it for themselves. Because at the end of the day, it's much easier to learn about something like, say, the motor engine than it is to invent it for the first time. It's much easier to learn how to build an airplane when you've been taught how the technology works than it is to invent the airplane. If every generation has to reinvent the engine or the airplane, then they will never progress beyond those things. In fact, they'll never likely even get to those things because they'll be so busy just trying to figure out how to plant a field for the first time. And this is why people in a vulnerable class, like the majority working class, are by tendency traditional. They're the ones who suffer the most when so-called progress uproots them and changes everything they know about their way of life. They're the ones that suffer from things like market crashes brought on by new financial systems or legislation that forces them to relearn everything they know. They are the ones who suffer when some fancy new technology makes their profession obsolete. They're the ones who suffer when the old technology that they're finally getting used to and integrating into their way of life is suddenly denounced as incompatible with our enlightened environmental policies and then taxed out of existence. Everyday, hardworking people are not the ones clamoring for change. Reliability and a stable, predictable way of life is their priority, which is what tradition provides, while also providing manageable and predictable progress at a pace that can be digested. So again, most people are not progressive by temperament, which may come as a surprise. It's the elite who tend to be more choleric in temperament. In fact, most studies on this question suggest that the richest and the most powerful people in the world are choleric in temperament, which means that they are more ambitious, less willing to follow direction, less cautious, more willing to force or accept change, and less tolerant of possible limitations on their ambitions. They are the ones who are held back by traditions that resist sudden and disruptive change. Common working people are more phlegmatic by temperament and more resistant to sudden and unexpected change. And if you doubt this is true, there are plenty of examples we can look at, especially from history, which actually defy popular sentiments about history. Like, it's popularly believed that the great and dramatic strides of change that have taken place in various eras were motivated by the popular majority, the people. Take something like the Protestant Reformation. Nobody in the 16th century was saying to themselves, hey, I want an entirely new church to replace the one that my parents and my grandparents went to, and which has defined our community's culture for hundreds of years. The new ideas and practices of Martin Luther and eventually John Calvin, and then eventually every single successor who broke away from their ancestors, first found favor among princes and nobility whose ambitions were held back by the uncompromising teachings of the Catholic Church, because in the old three-estate model of the medieval world, the ruling military class was relentlessly checked and resisted by the religious class, the clergy, bishops, and the Pope, which is something that the Protestant Reformation wanted to abolish. Take someone like Philip of Hesse, for example. His father died when he was extremely young, and by all accounts, his education and moral formation were severely lacking. He was more interested in power than piety or morality. He had serious political ambitions and desires to consolidate his power over rivals and subjects, so that when he met Martin Luther at the impressionable age of 17, just after succeeding to power, he was immediately attracted to the opportunities offered by this revolution that Luther had sparked. Philip was known as a fornicator and an adulterer throughout his adult life, and even became an advocate for bigamy, which Luther eventually sanctioned, likely to keep his powerful political ally happy, something the Catholic Church wouldn't have done. This was an obvious case of a powerful man embracing a disruptive movement for the moral advantage it gave him in his immoral life, and then the ability to impose it on his subjects. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because King Henry VIII did virtually the same thing, but at least in his case, he had the courtesy of either divorcing or, more often than not, killing his wives before marrying another, and so resented the church's refusal to sanction his behavior that he took control of the church in England and imposed his new religious order on all of his subjects, who likewise were not in any way interested in breaking with the church of their ancestors. And you could extract a similar narrative from countless progressive revolutions, from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution. It was always led by a powerful minority bloc looking to take advantage of the opportunities that presented themselves in times of disruption and turmoil, which they themselves created. In the words of Peter Baelish from the Game of Thrones series, chaos is a ladder, but tradition has always been a source of stability and reliability. It resists and prevents the chaos that such Machiavellian statesmen need to pursue their ambitions, whether political, sexual, financial, or just immoral. And you can even just look at the general behavior of most everyday people. They aren't out there pushing for dramatic change in their lives. Their priorities are their family's welfare, saving for retirement, getting a promotion, etc. They aren't pining for revolution and massively disruptive change in their lives. Which is a bit ironic, because it seems like most people like to think of themselves as daring progressives, but when it actually requires boldness and a contrarian spirit, most people show their true colors. Take something like your name. It's actually relatively easy to change your name in most states. It requires a minor fee and some paperwork, and as long as they don't suspect you of being a criminal, it will get approved. And then consider the fact that if most people had the opportunity to pick their name, they likely would not have chosen the name that they have. And yet, how many people actually bother to change their names? The actual number is like 1%. This in spite of the fact that surveys have suggested that something like 20% of people actively dislike their own names. So what does that tell us? It tells us that most people would rather just tolerate the things that they don't like than take risks or bold action to change it. Most people are traditional in a way that is averse to change. And that isn't the only thing you could point to. What about the fact that most people live in or near their hometowns in spite of the countless opportunities to move around in a country like America, which is filled with diversity of geography and climate? How about the fact that most people surveyed who hate their jobs are more likely to stay and put up with it rather than quit and find something else? How about all the people you can think of who habitually wear the same style of clothing for decades, or who vote for the same party out of habit, or use the default settings on their tech devices, or keep unused possessions, or routinely use the same password even though it's less secure? These kinds of behaviors describe most people, which again shows that the majority are by instinct more inclined to routine, to reliability, and stability. And even though that's not how I would define tradition, most people are tradition in the worst sense of that word. Disruptive change, or what we mean by modern progress, is a top-down imposition, and the only reason it works is because most people would rather go with the flow than fight back and resist, again because of their preference for peace and stability. And that's why tradition fails when it does. Traditional people, while the majority are more passive and phlegmatic, the choleric progressives are tenacious and relentless, and usually in possession of the means of imposing their will on the majority. Modern progress has always been a top-down initiative forced by the elites on the top. Just look at progressive political victories. Take something like same-sex marriage. That was put to a vote over 30 times at state levels and defeated every single time before it finally started to win. It's because the traditional majority didn't want it and weren't asking for it. But the relentless campaigning of the progressives, not to mention the media campaigns to alter their views, wore them down until it was inevitable, which could have only been possible by people with wealth and power. And like I said, this kind of top-down imposed progress actually harms the less powerful majority, who, though they want stability and a traditional way of life, can't access it unless there is something like a class traitor among the elite who will be their advocate against the whims of the powerful. I think this is why a lot of people are drawn to populists like Donald Trump. Whether or not he is a traitor of his own elite class, people seem to perceive that he is, and that he will be their advocate, which is why they voted for him, in spite of the media's relentless denunciation of both him and anyone who voted for him. But historically, this has always been the role of the Catholic Church. Though the clergy were filled with people of noble birth and almost always higher education, their priority was the preservation and the transmission of tradition. The Catholic Church has long been one of, if not the most powerful institution in the world, and a bulwark for ensuring that the Christian way of life continued to succeed from one generation to the next. Which is why the 20th century was so alarming to so many people who understand this, because the Catholic Church appeared to be abandoning its resolve in being a voice for tradition and a fortification against elites trying to consolidate their power and privilege under the disguise of progress. And this is why, more than ever, I think that what is needed in the church is a renewed emphasis on her vital role as a pillar of tradition and a defender of the poor and working class, who benefit the most from the head start that the tradition of their ancestors gives them and the protection against the instability that false progress imposes on them. Thanks for watching that. In case you're wondering, here's a great way to support my work. So if you're moving or buying or selling real estate, contact Real Estate for Life. They have 1,400 experienced faith-based agents in Canada and the USA, and finding a home isn't something to take lightly, which is why you want to have an advocate who understands your values. So if you're moving to a place like Alberta, where I live, or Texas, or anywhere Catholics are moving to, contact realestateforlife.org. That's realestateforlife.org.